but we'll start with kind of the history of GBTU and NEPRA as a partnership. And like Jeff said, I've been in this position for a little under a year. So I'm in the unique position of being able to talk to you guys about something that you all lived through and I did not. So write notes about everything I get wrong and you can grill me later. But basically, GBTU selected NEPRA as the Neponset River watershed as their home waters, following the 4 criteria set out by TU National, which is protect, so cold water resources that deserve protection, areas that deserve reconnection, so there's barriers along those cold water streams, areas that are in need of restoration, which obviously we have a lot of those in the greater Boston area, and sustainability, so the capacity for a lasting partnership for these waters. So not to brag, but the Neponset was selected out of the 2 candidates. Go us. And the home waters were declared in 2018, and we've been working in partnership pretty much ever since. So kind of, we said kicked it off in 2018, immediately hit the ground running. And so GBTU and NEPRA partnered on a project called Embrace a Stream, looking to look at brook trout especially, as well as brown trout in our watershed, and trying to understand our cold water resources and the populations that are in these areas. So funding was applied for in 2019. The project started in 2020, right alongside COVID. So some of the project components were delayed a little bit because of COVID. Obviously, the sampling procedures had to be adjusted to be COVID friendly. But sampling finished last year in 2021, and now we have all this wonderful data, a better understanding of the cold water systems within our watershed, and now it's time to act on it. But just give a little bit of rundown about what that project found. The goals of this project were to assess the current conditions of the trout streams within the Neponset, understand how the trout are using these streams, these cold water tributaries, identify the problem areas that need to be addressed in our watershed, and kind of triage them and prioritize them. I can move this out of the way. And also develop an action plan for moving forward with restoration projects and remediation projects within our watershed. All right, so that's all well and good, but what does that mean specifically? What actions were done? And so this project kind of broke down into 4 major, can you hear me okay, Len? Okay. 4 major categories. The first is to look at barriers to migration, so dams and culverts. So measuring the culverts that we have on our streams, assessing them for how much of a burden they cause for fish movement. Does that work? Yes. As well as looking at the temperature of our streams. So obviously, I don't need to explain to you all that trout prefer cold water. And one of the consequences of being in a suburban environment, as well as the effects of climate change or the warming of our waters. So trying to better understand how cold water or how this water is responding to those pressures. We looked at temperature using remote loggers and kind of measure the temperature of the streams over the course of a full year. We also looked at assessing the habitat within these cold water reaches. So looking for pools, riffles, and runs, major substrate, the things that trout need to live happy and fulfilled lives. And then kind of the last presence of trout themselves, using eDNA, which is environmental DNA. So rather than looking for the fish themselves, which is a little bit time consuming and difficult, you can basically look in the water for the presence of their DNA, which we sent off to a lab. And that both tells you their presence and also a little bit of a quantifying how many trout there are within a specific area. And one thing I don't want to leave off is another major goal is to engage with enthusiastic volunteers, all of you, NEPRA volunteers, members of the community who don't normally think about the streams that flow in their backyard, trying to get them involved and thinking about being good stewards of their environment. So those are what are part of the project at large. And so the question then becomes, what did we find? So kind of going in the same order in terms of barriers. So we were able to map out the culverts and dams on our cold water streams. And this is, I don't know if you can see it, it's a little bit blurry on my side, but mapping culverts from how severe they impair movement, from moderate to severe and significant, as well as dams, whether those dams are affecting connectivity, so how well trout can move up and down the stream, if they're impairing flow in any way, if they're keeping populations out of the headwaters, or if they're stopping trout from accessing the main stem of the Neponset, which they might use to move between these tributaries. So by using all this and the fantastic work of our volunteers, we were able to map these barriers and kind of identify what issues that the trout in our watershed face and how best to address that moving forward. In terms of temperature, there were a lot of findings, and I'm not going to go into all of them. But one of the big takeaways, which seems a little bit self-evident, let me see if I can move this out of the way. I'm just trying to get that little black bar to not be where it is. No, it's just on the other screen. That's fine. I'll talk around it. So basically, one of the things we found is that, unsurprisingly, where trout were found, the water temperatures were lower. So they're both lower in the spring and in the summer. And that really tells us that trout prefer those colder waters, but also those warmer areas, the places we found warmer water, are issue areas that we might want to address through. Okay, our issue areas where we might want to try and shade those streams more, or get them access to colder flowing water. Okay. Yes, so new culverts are supposed to accommodate trout. There's a whole set of criteria that Chris's department overseas that are supposed to facilitate easy movement of fish. But one of the consequences of being in the New England area, some of these culverts were built quite some time ago, and so they're not up to the current standards. And as we identify them as barrier issues, or as they start to degrade, as we replace them, we want to replace them with things that are less of a burden for our fish populations. Yeah, and so taking the temperature into account, again, there's more specific data about which streams have more temperature issues on them, but generally we want to address this temperature fluctuation and kind of expand the range of our cold water fish. In terms of habitat, trout were also found in areas that had more habitat units, so a greater density of pools, riffles, and runs for every 100 meters. So things that have pretty much very similar or very homogeneous habitat aren't great for trout. And also trout were found in areas where there's enough cobble for them to create their nest habitat. And then finally, in terms of the presence of the trout, and again, I'm hoping it's looking a little better out there than it is from this angle, but we're able to see where trout are found. We can see that we've got 4 or 5 pretty good sections of trout populations. So Beaver Brook in Sharon, Traphole Brook in Sharon, Walpole, and Norwood, Germany Brook in Norwood, Ponkapog in Canton, and Pine Tree Brook running through Milton and Canton are the major sources, the major places where we have brook trout in our watershed. And so those are obviously our key priorities in looking forward to improving the water quality for these fish. And then throwing it all together, getting back to this outreach idea is we put this all into an interactive map. So this is an online map that you can go and access. Overlay individual data layers if you want to know about stream temperature and where trout were found, or which culverts are passable and which ones are not. All this is available online that anyone can go and pull up. which I think is a fantastic resource for education. Trying to communicate with someone, you can zoom into their specific neighborhood and tell them about their issue areas, or the ones that they, the trails in which they run along, and in the areas in which they have their community. So it's a great way of making people more invested in these kind of conservation projects. And so right before I turn it over to Chris, I just want to mention one of the things we found. Again, I mentioned cold water or brown trout on, not brown trout, brook trout on Traphole Brook. One of the major barriers we found on Traphole Brook, and was known before this, and this process was well underway before the Embrace Stream project, but the mill pond on Traphole Brook, right at Sumner Street in Norwood, was the only dam on this tributary that holds significant trout resources both above and below it. And so that dam was thought to be a major barrier to their movement. The pond itself, relatively shallow, big, open, no canopy. And so that pond is starting to develop issues for the trout by warming the water, lowering the dissolved oxygen, as well as being a threat to human life if that dam were ever to fail. So by partnering with DER and the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs through their Municipal Vulnerability Program, we were able to pull this dam out in partnership on this large project that Chris is going to talk about. So I'll hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, Sean. Can you hear me okay? So I just want to start by saying it's great to be back. I think this is like my third or fourth presentation at GBTU, and if you're not sick of me yet, you will be by the end of this. So yeah, talking about the Traphole Brook Dam Removal Project. This was something that was completed this year, and much help was given by both the Neponset River Watershed Association and Greater Boston Trout Unlimited. So just a little bit of background about our division. So we are the Division of Ecological Restoration, or DER. We're housed within the Massachusetts Department of Fish and Game, underneath the Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. Our mission is to restore rivers, wetlands, and watersheds for the benefit of people and the environment. So a lot of our projects often have benefits both for communities as well as environmental benefits. We focus on four main project areas. We do culvert replacements, mainly for continuity purposes, as well as community enhancements. Undersized culverts pose threats, to populations that are segmented on streams, but they also pose threats for our infrastructure. An undersized culvert isn't going to be able to pass the large storms that we're anticipating that are coming on the way with climate change. Same is true with dam removals. A lot of focus on habitat improvements, increasing connectivity, eliminating risks due to climate change and natural disasters. We also work in freshwater and coastal wetland areas, and we have one focus basically on cranberry bog restoration. So when cranberry bog farmers retire their farms, we help to restore them back to natural areas rather than allowing them to age the way they do, and they sort of develop more into sort of scrubby shrub areas. So I work within the dam removal practice area. So I focus almost exclusively on removing dams in the Commonwealth, work all over the state. Those of you who might not be familiar may be asking yourselves, why remove dams? What's the problem with dams? There's a number of different reasons why. One is the negative environmental impacts that dams cause. So when you put a dam in a river, you're basically putting a wall in the river. And what rivers do at their most primal level is they move water and they move sediment. And when you put a wall in the middle of the stream, all of that sediment that it's moving and all of the water hits against that wall and backs up. That causes a number of problems, one of which is that impounded sediment buries what would be the natural substrate of the stream. So you get mucky, muddy bottoms in the bottoms of ponds. That still slow water warms up in the sun. You know, if you think about a pond, it's wider than it is long typically. And in those cases, you don't get a lot of shade over the water and the water's slow moving. It heats up, it loses dissolved oxygen. Those types of effects are often seen downstream of the impoundment as well. It takes a while for the water to cool off as it comes over and heats up on a dam. And so it's really important to get those out for habitat purposes, but also for allowing fish and other aquatic animals to move upstream and downstream freely as they would naturally. One thing, it's sort of hyperbole, but not really, is their climate change landmines. They're all over the landscape. In Massachusetts, there's over 3,000 dams, most of which were put up hundreds of years ago when water power was the main source of power for the industries in America. And they're still out there and they're not being maintained. The Office of Dam Safety with DCR regulates them and inspects them and ensures that they're kept compliant, but oftentimes they're not well mapped. They may not be known to the Office of Dam Safety. They're a huge burden, cost burden on the owner, and oftentimes the owner may be hard to find. And so an example recently, last weekend, a dam in Western Mass, this was in the Berkshire Eagle on Monday morning, a dam in Western Mass actually breached because of the big rains that we had recently. And it wasn't even an exceptional rain, you know, I think maybe inch, 2 inches of rain. The dam was built in the 90s for a retirement home to basically have something nice for people to look at. The retirement home had since closed. The owner was sort of unknown at that point. And so the dam wasn't maintained. The storm came through. Thankfully, no one was hurt. It damaged some property, and now the lawyers are trying to figure out who's to fault for that. So the next question you might ask is why Traphole Brook, although Sean did a great lead up to this. So in 2018, Norwood, who was part owner of the dam, applied for a priority project status with our division. The way we accept new projects is through a competitive process called our priority projects. People come to us with their projects and we select the ones that we want to get involved in. The reason that we selected this Traphole Brook project was well documented and excellent cold water habitat, both upstream and downstream of the dam. Data that was collected both by NEPRA and GBTU showed a clear temperature and dissolved oxygen impact that was being caused by the dam. The dam itself was another one of the many dams that was in poor condition. There was a section that had already breached during a storm at unknown time. And it was the only dam on the brook. So restoring this basically reconnected the entire system. So you get a big impact from doing one project. Our goals for this project were to improve habitat for native brook trout, to improve the public safety by removing this threat flooding downstream, to enhance recreational opportunities. So this pond, historically filled in with sediment, was a really popular fishing destination. And so we wanted to honor that and continue that use into the future. And then also to reduce this maintenance and liability that's being held by the town as well as a private landowner. So with those goals in mind, we set out to put a design together. This might be harder to see than I was hoping it would be, but the design had to be fish passable. So we had to find a slope that provided velocities and depths that were year round under low flow and high flow going to be able to pass fish. We needed our design to provide good habitat for the fish. So we added woody debris structures deep pools and riffles that both add oxygen, but also add slower water for the fish to rest in as well as hunt. We had to enhance recreation, so we put planned points for people to be able to access the water from the public side. One of the big challenges at this site, and one of the reasons why we took such a heavy engineering approach, was the protection of upstream and downstream infrastructure. So if you look at this longitudinal view here, you can see that the upstream road was 10 feet above the natural stream channel downstream. And we basically had 10 feet of mud that we had to work our channel back up through in order to not cause erosion issues at that culvert. Because if you could imagine, if we just let it all go, that cut is going to go straight up to that bridge and essentially or potentially erode out that. So we had to put in special structures to stabilize that and make sure that there's going to be no issues at the road. And downstream of this is an apartment complex that already suffers from flooding issues. So we couldn't just release a whole bunch of sediment settles right next to their apartments and make the flooding issue worse. And then the big literally $1 million question, what to do with all of the sediment? You know, we have 10 feet of mud in certain sections that we needed to remove. I think in the end, we removed several thousand cubic yards of sediment from the site. And we had to come up with a plan to do that.
Chris,
Yes.
was any of that sediment problematic or contaminated?
Luckily, sorry, yes. So the question was any of the sediment problematic contamination wise? The answer is a little complicated. So there were some levels of pollutants within the sediment. It wasn't above what is considered a risk to human health or environmental risk, but they were what you would expect to find in an urban type environment. So it wasn't, pristine, clean sediment, but it was able to be used and disposed of at a landfill where it didn't have to go to a specialized facility for hazardous waste. So once we had our plan that met all of those design criteria and we got all our permits and we were all ready to go, the COVID economy strikes again. So we had a cost estimate and an anticipation of going into this project of it costing around $900,000, a little more than $900,000. And we had at that point raised over $1 million. And we're all excited. This was early 2021 and the supply chains were a disaster and the construction industry was going haywire. And we put the project out to bid and it came back with our lowest bid at 1.6 million. And there was no way we were going to make up that gap in funding. So what we did is we tweaked some things. We tried to clarify things. We got some feedback from the bidders as to why the bids were so high. Went back out to bid. This time, the lowest bid was 1.3 million, let's say. And just to give you an idea of how crazy the variability was, our highest bid was over $4 million for this project. So things were all over the place. And that we thought was a doable gap. We roll the dice, see what we can raise in a couple months. And that was our mad dash to cash. And that's where you guys came in. And so Greater Boston Trout Unlimited helped to fill that gap. And one of the things that was super fortunate for us was MVP had extra money that they were looking to put towards the project, or was available to put towards the project. But the caveat was their money requires a 1/4 match. And so we needed to find non-state money that could match that. And your $5,000 that you donated was transformed into $25,000. And that plus some additional state and federal funds that we were able to scrounge up, we were able to find that 200,000 and bring the project forward. So now's the fun part of the presentation. These are all beautiful photos that Sterling took, or mostly beautiful photos that Sterling took of the site. And you get a sense of what things looked like as construction went on. So this here is just before construction started. So we drained the impoundment mostly as much as we could prior to help the sediment dry out a little bit. You can just see how much mud there was behind the dam. So this is the spillway of the dam, and it's essentially a flat mud plain all the way upstream. I mean, the whole thing was filled to capacity essentially. So on a bitterly cold day in January, we removed the dam. That was the first step of the project. Removing the dam took about 4 hours, 6 hours, maybe. The rest of the project took 6 months. So removing the dam was the easy part. The next thing we had to do was dig a big hole. So we had to dig space for the channel as well as the floodplain, because you can imagine as storms come through, the river's going to expand, it's going to contract, and we need to give space for that. And so we dug a huge channel up through all of that mud, in some places 10 feet deep, to accommodate the new river. So here you can see, you might be asking yourself, how does one build a river with water flowing through? And the answer is you don't. You control what you use water control practices like this. You build a temporary river on the side of your site out of your work area so you can work in what's called the dry. And that's oftentimes one of the most challenging parts of these types of projects. And when things go wrong, 9 times out of 10, it's an issue with water control. As you can see here, they're just starting to build the channel. So down at this end is where the dam was. This is some of the habitat enhancements that we added to the stream. So these are root wads that were harvested from the dam berm when we removed that, as well as from a couple other sources on conservation land that we put in the edges of the deep pools on the outside of bends. They provide scour protection for those banks on that side. They also provide really great habitat for fish that would take hundreds of years to establish naturally if we were to just leave the system on its own. So this gives a good jump start and good habitat in this reach that would otherwise be sort of sterile for the first several decades. Here you can see we're starting to work on, this is just before we put water through the channel. So you can see they're reconnecting. This is the upstream stretch of the river. You get a good view of that habitat structure there just before it was reconnected to the lower section. So you can see they switched midway through the water control. The water control was on the left bank, now it's on the right bank. And here it is, freshly minted, first flows flushing through the system. So you can see they've now built up the banks on either side that's been seeded and planted. And then you can see they've completed those habitat structures. So most of it is all buried underneath the bank, the majority of the structure, with just sort of the rooty provide the great habitat for fish and structure for fish in the pools. So this was the 6-month journey, before and after view from the same position. So this is standing basically where the dam was. You can see it there in the below or in the left-hand photo. And it's just a huge stark difference in between what the habitat was and what it now is. And it's only getting better. So this is taken, I believe 2 weeks ago now. So you can see the fall foliage starting to come in. All of those banks are getting vegged up. There's a whole bunch of new trees that have been planted that will be sprouting and growing in the next few years. And I think in the next 5 years, a person that wasn't aware of all the work that went into this would have no idea, or at least that's our goal, is that this just is a natural system and this is just another part of the stream. And it's a beautiful spot. This spot in particular is right next to where the parking is. This is a great access point if you wanted to try and your luck here. There's a couple of great pools. The wading depth is probably about knee deep. Some of the pools are about 3 to 4 feet deep. So definitely encourage people to try their luck down there. But the $1 million question is, what's the actual effect of this? Are we seeing any benefits of this? And so in August, maybe 2 months after construction was completed, we went out and did a survey with Mass Wildlife, an electrofishing survey. And the good news is that trout are coming back, despite the fact that it was an extremely hot day. I think it was in the low to mid 90s. We found trout downstream, upstream, and within the newly constructed channels. So it was already showing early signs of success. I think the populations are only going to get stronger once we get more shade on that water and more time for things to really establish there. And with that, I will turn it over to Sean.
Thanks, Chris. So that's a great summary of this project. As Chris said, it's a 6-month project, and you can really see the change that happened over the course of the time. But as we all know, with these restoration projects, it doesn't end when the construction vehicles drive away. And so we really want to know, what's next for this site, and what's next for the, the other tributaries in our watershed. So the first thing is to adjust our vocabulary. It's no longer Mill Pond. It doesn't exist anymore. So now we're calling it Peswick Park, which was it's always been its name, but it's the name that we're trying to get to catch on, and stop calling it Mill Pond anymore. But from our perspective, what are we going to do there next? So we're going to keep our monitoring the site. So we've got temperature, dissolved oxygen, connectivity loggers on the site. We're looking at invertebrates and fish, as well as DEP is also looking at those features as well. We're looking to put in some new signage. So, and we've been working with GBTU on that as well. So signs that talk about, the process of dam removal, signs that talk about the history of the site. And then I think what I think is the best is signs that talk about trout biology and the process of rivers and river biology. So this is an example of actually at Mass Wildlife's headquarters out in Western, I guess it's not Western Mass. They have a trout pool in their building. And then this is kind of an example of the signage that we're hoping to put in the park itself. And one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about as part of a outreach project during the construction is we did some live staking. So that's putting in live dogwood as these kind of 1 foot stakes. You kind of just root them into the ground, and because they're so hardy and able to develop fast, they'll grow out their roots. They'll really stabilize that bank. And in an ideal scenario, they'll also kind of grow out and shade out the bank itself as well. So we did that as a volunteer project, mostly with GBTU help back in April. As we look forward to the future of this project, the landscaping company will come out and do a little bit more of it themselves. But we're also looking to kind of expand that. The town of Norwood just reached out to me last week and said, while they're doing that, can we think about doing some more live staking as a volunteer project and kind of really stabilizing the downstream areas. And so that's what the future looks like for this section of Traphole Brook. We also have some lessons learned for NEPR, at least. I'm sure DER has their own lessons learned. But for me, seeing through this project, one of the first things I did in this job is that dam removals are a really hands-on project. It's a lot of time to oversee these projects. And so this idea is they're great to do, but they should be done in parallel. While we're overseeing this longer term project, something that takes 6 months, takes a significant amount of oversight, we should also be doing smaller projects as well. So we get things done, kind of 2 scales. I love this picture. This is also from another volunteer effort to do this shading. So this is us putting in larger than I promised trees along the bank of Traphole Brook. But I really love this picture, not only because it's a massive tree going into a hole, but it's everyone pushing on this tree, trying to get it in one area, but not everyone's doing the same thing, right? Some people are steering the root mass. Some people are trying to make sure no one gets whacked by the branches, but we're all trying to get it in the hole, right? And so I think that's a great metaphor for this project, is that, you know, there's the things that NEPA are doing, the things that state agencies are doing, the things that town's doing, things that GBTU is doing, all towards the same goal. And that's the big picture and the big takeaway is working towards this conservation goal in our own fields and working together. In terms of other next steps, you know, in other areas, things we take away from the Embrace a Stream project, we have culvert improvements across the watershed, but one of the next ones up, at least from our perspective, is still on Traphole Brook over in Sharon. Right on the border with Norwood, there's Moose Hill, and it's a significant barrier. The culvert itself is starting to fall apart, and we've kind of lined up the funding to get that one underway, hopefully in the next year. We're also going to expand our temperature and dissolved oxygen monitoring. So trying to understand a little bit more about the cold water, also not limited to cold water, trying to the other sites we monitor for bacteria and nutrients throughout our watershed. We're trying to move our temperature monitoring to there. Habitat and revegetation. So like I said, live staking, riparian planting. Beaver Brook is a really great example area where we might be able to provide a lot of shade cover in an area that, you know, it's restricted from tree growth because it's near some train tracks. And we might be able to kind of really revitalize that area for trout habitation. We're also going to look to promote some land for conservation. That's kind of a watershed-wide project. So identifying areas that could be purchased by town conservation commissions, held in trust, and left undeveloped or de-develop them as best we can to kind of provide this protection to our vulnerable fish populations. And like I said, one thing that we keep coming back to is making sure that we're getting the larger public involved. So like I said, we're talking about signage at Peswick Park. One of the things we're looking forward to doing, working with GBTU on, is to put QR codes on those signs. That'll point us to a website that talks, you know, broadly about dam removal, kind of get people interested in trout protections and how they can advocate for this kind of project in their neighborhood and get this ball rolling, not just in the Neponset, but in the Charles and across Massachusetts and across New England, trying to get that enthusiasm up, because it all starts in the community, right? And so that's kind of the goal in communicating and getting that through with the public. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. Chris, happy to take questions. But I'd like to thank all our partners. So it takes a village to get this done. So DER did a lot of the heavy lifting on the dam removal, but a lot of the funding, as Chris mentioned, came from the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs and Energy, or Energy and Environmental Affairs, through their Municipal Vulnerability Program, and their ferocious work to not only provide the money in the first place, but to come back to the table and find that gap that Chris mentioned. It also wouldn't have been possible without some of our cash match. As Chris mentioned, we needed to kind of match the funds provided by the state agencies. So a lion's share of that came from the natural resources damages. So money coming out of the Blackburn and Union Superfund, which is overseen by Mass DEP and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So they've been great partners in this. The town of Norwood, as a co-owner of the dam, GBTU, obviously everyone here, for kicking in and raising that money that, you know, met its match and helped us get this project underway. And all the GBTU and NEPA volunteers that helped Embrace a Stream and collect this data that made the priority project viable, and will make all the other projects easy dominoes to tip over. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat. I just, when Kate said, really amazing story. Congratulations. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
With the infrastructure bill, is there a lot more funding available for these kind of projects than there might have been?
So the question is, with the infrastructure bill coming through the federal government, is there more money for restoration? Yes, lots and lots of money available right now, which is great. Both through the infrastructure bill as well as the American Rescue Plan. There is almost too much money at this point. We're really struggling to get it all out the door. And to have enough people on the ground to manage the projects to get all this work done. So it's actually a very exciting time.
Traphole Brook is a great trout stream.
Yes, so the question was, were the neighbors resistant to the project, or was there a barrier from the community? Very good observation. That is, in this case, the pond was half owned by the town and half owned by 4 neighbors. Those 4 neighbors, because the pond had become so full of sediment and was basically a mosquito breeding ground, they were sort of fed up with the condition that it was in. And the town really didn't express any interest in dredging it to recreate the pond, because they would have had to have dredged it, but they would also have to basically rebuild the dam that was actually holding the pond because it had breached. And so the town really had no interest in it. They were ready to be done with the dam altogether. And so what we were offering was a solution for something better than what they currently had. They couldn't go back to the pond. That just wasn't, on the table. And so they really bought into this idea of having a nice, beautiful, free-flowing stream through their yard rather than having this mud pit that they're worried about kids getting stuck in the muck and everything else. There were some opposition in the community at large. There always is for these types of projects. People don't like things to change. I can certainly relate to that. And so a lot of that comes down to education and really explaining why you're doing these things, what it's going to look like, why it's going to be better than what it is now. And oftentimes people do come around. There'll always be some people that will never be happy with anything, but oftentimes people after these projects look at it and say, oh yeah, you actually did a nice job. This looks really good. Yes.
Is there any policy in the state government for repairing dams? For example, I live near the Charles River by Echo Bridge, and a new dam, a small piece of the dam was built there about a year and a half, 2 years, maybe 4 years ago. And maybe it was necessary flood control or other appropriate reasons, but when a dam is repaired, is there a review process in the state?
So the question was, is there review and oversight for repairing dams? And the answer is yes. So it's not our office. We're not involved in any sort of regulatory, but the Department of Conservation and Recreation houses the Office of Dam Safety, and they're really in charge of regulating dams across the state. So anytime you make an alteration, repair, modification to a dam, you need approval from them.
Are they considering these environmental water fishery issues, or are they just considering public safety if the dam is not repaired?
I really can't speak to that. I don't know.
Chris, there was a comment earlier online about which you may have kind of certainly touched on earlier, but the question is how can we improve engagement with the towns for that kind of context?
That sounds like a Sean question to me.
Yeah. Yeah, so what can we do to improve town engagement specifically? So a lot of that, it's just communication with the towns. I think the MVP program through the executive office is a great program to get the towns involved. So I think it's something like 97% of all towns in Massachusetts have done the planning phase, where they lay out their priorities in climate climate adaptation. And then that sets the stage for them to receive these action grants like this dam removal. So it gets them thinking about that these projects are possible. And then, you know, then the next step is to actually go ahead and do it. And I think part of that is making sure that the towns feel like they have a partner or set of partners. So like I said, this project couldn't have been done without everyone involved. And you know, a conversation I had recently with the conservation agent in Norwood is that, you know, without the funds provided by GBTU, this project would have been dead in the water. And so it's really about creating a community all towards that same goal. And NEPA really takes its role in communicating with these individual towns in our watershed seriously and saying, like, you know, we should consider this. To the question about, you know, whether you repair a dam or not, a lot of people, when a dam is in place, the impulse is it's starting to fail. Well, let's fix it. It's the impulse of no change. Like, okay, it's something's wrong with it. We're going to fix it. It's very hard to get in the mindset of saying, well, let's imagine a world without it. And kind of like Chris was saying, you know, these neighbors, they have to take a risk on something. And I think it's a very brave thing to do, to say, okay, we have this pond, we're not happy with it, but we're willing to set it into the hands of the town and the hands of these people to create something new. And especially, you know, they walk out the door in late March and it looks like a bomb has been dropped in their backyard, to have the faith to see that through and say, like, I see your vision. You know, I understand, I trust that the process is working out. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, when you see what it looks like come July, everyone is on board and say, okay, I understand. But a lot of that's being able to point to successful projects, being able to point to, you know, if a town is hesitant, say like, well, go talk to Norwood, that they have an experience with having this done successfully.
I can just say, because I talked to two of the four sets of neighbors at the ribbon cutting a month ago. And boy, they're really happy that they did it. You can tell they like the idea that now they live next to a beautiful trout stream. And the town representatives seem pretty proud, justifiably so.
Yeah.
As well, and you know, glad they were part of it. So we have like a lot of happy advocates. Although, you know, what do they say? Success has, you know, as many parents.
Yeah.
I have a question. Do you have any estimate on how much sediment was removed during the project? Was it like the floodplain that was all sort of cleared out and restored as well? And sort of the second part to that is to sort of rebuild the stream bed and return to what I think was the original sort of stream bed, or is there any information on sort of the original geomorphology of the stream in that section where the dam was installed?
Yeah, so the question was, for those on Zoom, question was, do we have a sense of how much sediment was removed, and then how that channel was designed to kind of follow either the existing stream bed or the current geomorphology? I'll toss over to Chris for the design phase, but I can say that since I was submitting the reimbursements, I know that the amount of sediment removed was more than 5,000 tons, and I don't know what that is in square cubic yards, but that's a lot.
Yeah, I think it was something around 2,700. I don't know why that number's in my head, but I think that it was in that ballpark, at least, cubic yards of sediment. The design question about the historic channel. So we didn't really know where the historic channel was because it was buried under so much sediment. And to be honest, the channel orientation and the course that it took was really pulled out of someone's imagination. Remember the constraints that we were working under. We had to basically get the right slope. So we had to have enough meanders in it so that we had enough. Oh. Okay, can you hear it with this?
Go ahead.
Okay. Hopefully you can hear this, but so one of the things, we had to give the stream enough length to make up that slope and still be fish passable. But there was also the neighbors, each of them wanted waterfront property still, you know, their house had waterfront property. So we had keep the property lines in mind as well and make sure everybody gets a bend and everybody gets a little piece of the pond, or of the, not the pond, the stream now, on their property. So some people got better pieces, you know, nice deep pools on their property. Other people got nice riffles. Depends on your perspective if you're trying to fish it or not. But yeah, in the end, it was sort of just came out of the engineer's imagination. Jeff, oh, sorry.
I was going to chime in a little bit on that also.
Federation. By that is, you've got 3,000 dams, you've got local efforts working on one or another, or maybe not. You've got DER working really a lot of different places. Neponset working. Charles doing their thing. Folks out in Massachusetts, out west, something else. So it seems to be there's an opportunity. It's going on already for sharing successes, for sharing technical expertise, permitting, and how to be real crafty and clever about fundraising. But also demonstrating to neighbors, local stakeholders, that nothing except your local. Some of them are freaking out, some want to out, and being able to say. There's a body of knowledge. Say, I'm be hanging out with movies. So, anything on that?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question in a second, but I just want to point out the question about the path the stream used to take is that the pond has been a pond in some form or another since the 1700s. So in some cases, you might be able to go back to an old map and say like, okay, here's what it looked like. I don't think that was a possibility at all. So the question Jeff just asked is, you know, is there any kind of information sharing, both at the nonprofit or NEPR type organizations or at the state level to get these you know, shared experiences, you know, shared problems, ways of communicating and engaging with the public. And I will say one thing that I think is a really great resource from the nonprofit side is Mass Rivers Alliance has set up community meetings. So, you know, every 2 months, we talk with our neighbors at the Charles River, the Mystic, the Ipswich, and talk about issues, you know, that affect not just dams, but water quality monitoring and all these other issues that affect our watershed, and problem solve and kind of partnership alongside that. I've also been trying to get us more involved in organizations like Society for Ecological Restoration, which have meetings, kind of go and hear. There's like the academic side, the technical side from the state agencies, and the nonprofit side, and all of those working together. There's a number of those, especially here in New England, a lot of regional conferences that are really great for information sharing.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I love the idea, Jeff. I think, you know, organizing on that scale would be incredible. And we're starting to move in that direction, but it's still very much organization by organization, everybody in their little territory doing their thing, and not a lot of cross pollination going on. DER is working on that a little bit. We're starting to, at least with our, we have a partnerships program where we are basically paying for somebody's salary to be at a nonprofit or regional partner, and basically setting them up with a lot of opportunities to learn, working with DER to build capacity statewide. Because when you have 3,000 dams, there's no way one little agency is going to be able to tackle all of that. We really need to build the capacity and the ability for other organizations to take these projects on themselves as well, and really sort of build a community that's all working together in unison to tackle this issue. And it's not just here in New England, it's also global. So there's a huge dam removal movement going on in Europe right now. And our executive director, Beth, has spoke multiple times at conferences there, and they've got a lot of interesting stuff going on. So definitely Google that and see there's like a new movie that's coming out recently that they're premiering, I want to say this month, just about the dam removal movement in Europe. And, you know, in a lot of ways, there's international cross-pollination going on, but it's still very new. I mean, we've only been really focusing on removing dams for a couple decades now, so it's still an evolving practice. Sterling.
So if you wanted to fish as part, the south bank, is that the property owner all the way back that are stay on the board?
Yeah, so if you're walking the banks, definitely stay on the side that you parked on. So there's a trail, there's a parking lot from Sumner Street. If you're in somebody's yard, you're in the wrong spot. Get out of somebody's yard, essentially.
Those property owners, pour out that little wet and water.
Yeah, and in some cases into the stream. Yeah, yeah. If you're wading, that's fine. You can wade any navigable water body in Massachusetts, but you can't to their yard. Obviously, you want to be respectful of them. Yes, stay on the north side. Okay. I don't know offhand. I'm sorry. I would search Europe dam removal movie, something like that. Yeah.
We can do that, yes.
Yeah, I can send you an email for sure.
Traphole Brook, the fine stream, as it becomes better known, more and more efficient, less expensive, at least of trout. So, if you want to comment on that, I had some personal thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, you know, as more and more people know about Traphole Brook, more fishermen will be attracted. And unless we're all committed to catch and release, we're going to sort of degrade this resource. And I think that's a huge concern. That's really hard to enforce catch and release. That's something that Mass Wildlife has to decide on. And, you know, I would certainly encourage anybody that goes to Traphole Brook or any stream that's similar to Traphole Brook, these smaller water bodies with native trout, little tiny fish, don't take the fish. These are really struggling systems, especially with climate change. As things are getting hotter, they're really starting to blink out. And, you know, I can't force you. I'm not an environmental police. I can't force you to catch and release, but I would hope that everybody, at least in this organization, would have the respect for the resources and the fish, not to, you know, knowingly damage the resource.
So you think you need to sign bridge?
Yeah, so that's the, Rui just asked if any signs might encourage that. And that we've, in our conversations with the town of Norwood, we've said we'd like to say catch and release, even if it's not legally enforceable or necessarily, you know, the law. But, you know, just it's like Chris said, it's a way to make sure this resource stays available for everyone. So our signage is going to encourage catch and release with maybe some creative language that makes it seem like it's legally enforceable, even if it might not be. Yes. But I also just want to Sterling's question about wading. The south side is all owned by property owners. They're all great people to work with. So I think if you're out there, just, you know, see someone, give them a wave. No, don't walk on their yard, but I think, you know, they know that the other side of the property is town owned, but it's also nice to just know it's not a stranger in their backyard. It's a community member and someone who's interested in this habitat.
Yeah, and oftentimes, you know, when we're talking with the neighbors, that's something that they brought up is they missed seeing people out there fishing. So I think they would be excited to see you out there. So definitely be friendly.
The guy with the young family brought his kid to the ribbon cutting.
Yeah.
He said, "Oh, he said, anytime you want to come to the place, I'll come out and show him where I cut." He was my view. We have to keep it a secret. We have to make it catch these.
this is like a big, busy, fishing waterway. People care about this and other stuff, all the other things you want to do, so I think it's a net benefit to have people use it.
Yeah.
So, for a little bit past, so maybe one last question.
If there's a question online about does the state stop travel? Stopping.
Yes, that's correct. So the question is about stocking. Does the state currently stock? They do not anymore. They did historically, but in the past 2 years, they've taken it off of the stocking list, mainly because of, us bringing it to their attention that there are these thriving native populations. And there's a whole controversy we could get into. We're already past 8 o'clock. We don't need to get into that of stocking over native populations, but the state has decided to take it off of their list.
There are other cold water streams in Neponset that they continue to stock over top of native populations, which is a conversation we want to have with them. Yeah. But that is a conversation we're hoping to continue to have with them. And
Right. Thank you, everyone.
So, first, got to get over here. Thank you. So first, I just want to thank Chris and Sean. They've been great partners, both in dual roles there and a new role for you, and all the work that you've done, and really a great presentation. So thank you. All of you that showed up either online or in the restaurant, thank you also. Also want to thank, Town of Norwood, state agencies, all that work that went into that, and the large amount of money that helped with that project. I also want to thank anyone that's online or in this room that volunteered, that donated money. The data that we collected from the story I got here convinced the state that this was a worthy project. And if we did not contribute as a community with all of our different backgrounds and skills, and time and money, this project might not have happened. So you can give a clap to yourself for the work that you have done to help support GBTU and NEPRA in restoring the stream to where it is today and more to come. So that, thank you, everyone.